I want to answer a question that I get in my inbox all the time, which is, what is a vector and why would I need to use one? A lot of people hear that word vector and they cringe because they either don't know what it is or they kind of know what it is and they hate them. So I kind of want to get you excited about vectors because there are a lot of awesome things that you can do with them once you open your mind to the possibility that you can work with them. I'm Liz Kohler-Brown, an artist, designer, and teacher, and I love sharing processes and resources with other creatives who like to make art on their iPads. So, number one, how are vectors different from raster images like a JPEG or a PNG? As you probably know, raster images are made of little squares called pixels. We all know about pixels, right? If something has not enough pixels, it looks kind of blurry or kind of blocky. If something has a lot of pixels, then it's really clear and crisp and it can be printed at a large size. So more pixels is better, right? Usually, I guess, unless you are worried about file size. Now, vectors are completely different. Forget about the squares. Vectors are little shapes made of points. So rather than being made of little squares, vectors are made up of mathematical points. So the mathematical points for a square would be like 1, 2, 3, 4. And no matter how big or small we make that square, that is always the formula, right? If it's an unusual shape, let's say it's a blob, it would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the intervals between those little dots are the mathematical equation that makes up that shape, right? Just like the square, but it's just a different shape and different intervals in between the dots. So when we make vectors, we're just putting down those dots and telling the machine where to put the dots and what the intervals are between the dots. So sometimes we get into more complicated stuff, right? I'm going to show you some paintings I did that I vectorized, and you can think about the little points. Where would the points go around these little leaf shapes? Well, they would just go all around the outside of it, and that would make up the shape. Now, because points are a little bit less detailed than squares could be, like if we had 5 million pixels, it could be a little more detailed than a vector with 10 points, for example. So we do try to simplify a little bit when we get into vectors. So here is a vector of that shape, that leaf shape that you just saw. And so this is just made of little points that tells the machine where the dots are around this shape. So, can you work with vectors? Of course you can. It is not as difficult as it sounds. And in fact, when I make vectors out of something like this shape that I showed you, I actually just paint this on paper and then I just use an app to turn it into a vector. So I rarely draw a vector. So if you're worried about working with that little pen tool and moving the Bezier curves and how difficult that is, I honestly don't even do that. I just make shapes and then turn them into vectors, and that's how I create my patterns. Now, I show this whole process in my classes on how to work with vectors, so I'm not going to go deep because it's a long process, but once you learn it, you can easily, I could turn this into a vector in, 30 seconds, and we would be ready to create a pattern with it. So it's not difficult. It just takes a little time to wrap your head around that concept of my art is not made of squares, it's made of mathematical points. So for the app, I like to use Affinity Designer, and I have a whole video about why that I'm going to link to in the description. So if you want to learn more about why I use that app when I work with vectors on my iPad, you can see all about that in the other video. So we covered what vectors are. Now let's talk about why you would use them. What is the incentive to use a vector instead of a raster image? Well, this is the thing about vectors. Because they're made of mathematical points, you can size them up infinitely, and those mathematical points always stay the same. So if someone says, hey, I love your pattern and I want to put it on a duvet cover, you can easily upsize your vector pattern and give it to them at the size they want, and they can put it on their duvet cover or their billboard or their whatever. It doesn't matter. vectors can be resized infinitely. Now let's say you make a pattern that's a raster-based pattern in Procreate, for example. So that pattern is, I don't know, 20 by 20 inches, and a company says, oh, we really need 25 by 25. That's a deal breaker. You can't use that pattern for that use because you can't upsize raster patterns. So when you work in raster, you're always limited by the size that you work in. You can't upsize from there. So that's why I work with vectors. I worked with raster images for years and years, and I just got tired of art licensors contacting me and asking me for a different size, and I was literally making that pattern again in vector, you guys. So I was taking a pattern that I had made in raster and turning it into a vector, and that is a long and boring process. It's hard enough to make artwork. It's even harder to remake the artwork that you made years ago that you hate and you don't want to look at again. So that's why for me at this point where I sell my art to art licensors and use it on print-on-demand shops, working in vector when it comes to something like patterns is really the only option for me. So should you work in vectors is really the big question why you're here, right? So if you are going to be a pattern designer, I would say you need to learn about vectors. You have to learn how to work with vectors if you're going to make patterns professionally. Now, if you're just going to design greeting cards and you're always going to work at 5 by 7, then you can use Procreate, work with raster images. It really doesn't matter. When it comes to vectors, it's all about the upsize, downsize, not getting that blurriness. If I was just going to design stickers for the rest of my life, I would just use Procreate and I would never think about vectors again. But for me personally, my art goes on a lot of different products at a lot of different sizes, so I really need that flexibility that comes from vectors. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There are a lot more videos on my channel about making artwork on your iPad that is professional and sellable. So if you like this video, let me know in the comments and tell me what you'd like me to answer next time. Bye.